Now look, I want you to sit with me for a few minutes because something happened this week that I think every American needs to understand. Not just the politics of it, the mechanics of it, how alliances between world leaders actually work, and what it looks like when one of those alliances starts to crack in a way that puts this country at risk. On July 28th, just hours before Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu walked into the White House for his first face-to-face meeting with President Trump since the two of them launched strikes on Iran back in February, the president went on Fox News and said something extraordinary. He said about his closest foreign ally, "I don't need Bibi to tell me that. Bibi's telling me that because he wants me to stay involved." Now, I've sat across the table from foreign leaders who had their own agendas. Every leader does. But I cannot recall a time when a sitting American president publicly accused his most important wartime partner of trying to manipulate him into continuing a military conflict, and did it on morning television 3 hours before they were supposed to shake hands. That is not a diplomatic disagreement. That is a fracture in the foundation of a wartime alliance. And the implications of that go far beyond what most of the coverage has been willing to explain. The Blue Bill laid out what the Pickaxe Mountain intelligence leak actually set in motion this morning. And once you see the chain of decisions it triggered, you understand why cable news barely touched it. Let me give you the big picture. To understand why that Fox News moment matters so much, you've got to understand what led up to it. On February 28th of this year, the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes on Iran, what the Pentagon called Operation Epic Fury. The stated objective was to destroy Iran's nuclear capabilities and eliminate its senior leadership. Supreme Leader Khamenei was killed on the first day. That's a staggering military achievement, and I want to be fair about that. The operational precision of those initial strikes was extraordinary, and the men and women who carried them out deserve recognition. But here's what happened next, and this is where things start to get complicated. Iran retaliated by clamping down on the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil supply passes every single day. Oil prices shot past $100 a barrel. Gas at the pump crossed $4. Diesel hit $5.10. American families started paying, on average, $500 more in fuel costs than they were paying before the war began. 18 American service members have been killed. Hundreds more have been wounded. The Pentagon estimates over $37 billion spent. And the war that President Trump said would last 4 to 5 weeks has now been going on for 5 months, 150 days, with no congressional authorization and no signed agreement. A ceasefire was reached in April, collapsed in early July when Iran attacked commercial ships during a diplomatic pause. And now we're in yet another cycle of escalation, followed by what officials are calling a mutual pause. That's the landscape Netanyahu walked into when he arrived at the White House. Now, here's what made that arrival so unusual. Netanyahu didn't come through the front entrance. He came in through a side entrance to the West Wing, barely visible to reporters. The meeting was completely closed to the press. Trump didn't open it for even a few minutes, which is a departure from how he's handled nearly every other foreign leader visit. There was no joint press conference afterward. Trump said nothing publicly after the meeting. The White House released a single sentence calling the talks positive and productive. Netanyahu, for his part, went on Instagram and Fox News and called it one of the best meetings they'd ever had. But the tone Trump had set that very morning told a different story. He'd been asked on Fox and Friends about reports that Netanyahu planned to present intelligence showing Iran was rebuilding nuclear capabilities inside Pickaxe Mountain, a fortified underground site near the Natanz nuclear facility. And instead of welcoming that intelligence, Trump dismissed it. He said the United States already knows exactly what's happening at Pickaxe through Space Force surveillance. He said it's not a big problem. And then he said the part that stopped me cold. Why don't you just tell it to me? Why do you have to announce it to the world? Think about what that means. The President of the United States is saying on live television that his own ally leaked sensitive intelligence to the press, not to inform the American public, but to box him into a military posture. That's not my interpretation. That's what Trump said. Now, let me tell you something. When I was president, I dealt with leaders who had complex domestic situations, leaders whose political survival depended on decisions that weren't always aligned with America's interests. That's the nature of diplomacy. You manage it. You handle it quietly, behind closed doors, through back channels, with a clear understanding that the public front stays unified, even when the private conversations get heated. What you do not do is go on national television 3 hours before a critical wartime meeting and accuse your ally of manipulating you. That's not strength. That's a loss of message discipline that tells every other leader in the world, friend and adversary alike, that this alliance is unstable. And there are people who will say Trump was being refreshingly honest, that he was putting Netanyahu on notice. I understand that argument. There's a case to be made that calling out manipulation publicly creates accountability. But the cost of doing it that way, on that morning, in the middle of an active military conflict with no authorization from Congress, is enormous. Because now Iran's negotiators know there's daylight between Washington and Jerusalem. Now every country watching, China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, understands that Trump himself questions whether Netanyahu is operating in good faith. Do you know what your household has actually paid in additional fuel costs since February because of how this war has disrupted the Strait of Hormuz? Because most people have no idea. The Blue Bill broke down the formula this morning, what the per household cost looks like by region, and how much higher it goes if the strait stays contested through the end of summer. If you're anywhere in the Midwest or the South, you need to see where your state falls. I'd recommend reading it. Here's why those numbers change the conversation going forward. What makes this moment different from any previous tension between an American president and an Israeli prime minister is the context surrounding Netanyahu's own political situation. He is facing active corruption charges, bribery, fraud, breach of trust, with his trial resuming this spring after delays caused by the state of emergency. He has formally requested a pardon from Israel's president. He faces the general election set for October 27th of this year, and every major political analyst covering Israel expects his coalition to lose. Governor Newsom said it plainly back in March. Netanyahu has his own domestic issues. He's trying to stay out of jail. He's got an election coming up. He's on the ropes. And when you layer that domestic pressure on top of the war, you start to see a pattern that should concern every American, regardless of party. Because a leader whose political survival depends on the continuation of a conflict has a fundamentally different set of incentives than a leader who is trying to end one. I'm not saying Netanyahu is deliberately prolonging American involvement for his own benefit, but I am saying that the structure of his situation creates that incentive, and that when your own president goes on television and says unprompted that his ally is feeding him intelligence specifically to keep him involved in the war, that's the President of the United States arriving at the same conclusion through his own observation. That's not a Democratic talking point. That came from Donald Trump's mouth. And this is where the institutional failure becomes impossible to ignore. Both chambers of Congress passed a War Powers Resolution on June 23rd, directing the President to end military operations in Iran. The House voted 215 to 208. The Senate voted 50 to 48, with 4 Republicans crossing party lines. That was the first time in American history that both chambers passed a resolution telling a president to withdraw forces from an active war zone under the War Powers Act. And the president effectively ignored it. Then on July 23rd, the House passed another one, 214 to 208. The same 4 Republicans joining every Democrat. Senator Schumer stood on the Senate floor and called the administration's approach a recipe for utter disaster. Senator Murphy warned that Trump has no moves left, that his incompetence has boxed America in. These aren't fringe voices. These are senior members of Congress from both parties saying the constitutional machinery of war authorization has been bypassed. I'll be honest. I served 2 terms and dealt with more than my share of military operations and legal authorities, and I hadn't seen anyone lay out exactly how the 60-day clock interacts with the new notification Trump filed in July until the Blue Bill walked through it this morning. That changes everything about how you read what's actually authorized right now. So what happens next? I see 3 possible paths, and none of them are clean. The first is that this mutual pause that started around July 25th holds. Negotiations resume through Oman or Switzerland, and both sides find their way to a framework that addresses Iran's nuclear ambitions without requiring permanent American military presence in the region. That's the best outcome, and I hope we get there. The second path is that the pause collapses, the way the April ceasefire collapsed in early July, and we enter another cycle of escalation with oil back above $100 a barrel and American service members in increasing danger, all heading into a midterm election season where Republicans hold razor-thin majorities in both chambers. That scenario is devastating not just militarily, but economically. American families cannot absorb another spike in fuel and shipping costs on top of what they've already been paying. The third path, and this is the one that keeps me up at night, is that the relationship between Trump and Netanyahu deteriorates to the point where neither leader trusts the other's intentions, but neither can afford to walk away. Netanyahu needs American military power to deal with Iran. Trump needs the political cover of Israeli partnership to justify the war to his base. That kind of mutual dependency without mutual trust is how you get decisions that serve no one's national interest. It's how wars drift from defined objectives into open-ended commitments that cost lives and treasure without any clear measure of success. And that brings me to what I want to leave you with. The question isn't whether Trump was right to be frustrated with Netanyahu. Based on everything we've seen, the intelligence leaks, the domestic political calculations, the pattern of escalation that conveniently aligns with one leader's survival needs, there are legitimate reasons for frustration. The question is what you do with that frustration when you're the President of the United States, when 18 Americans have already died, when Congress has told you twice to stop, when your own words on live television reveal that you believe your ally is trying to keep you in a war. The answer has to involve the institutions this country was built on. It has to involve Congress asserting its constitutional authority over war. It has to involve the American people demanding transparency about what this conflict is actually costing them and who it's actually serving. Next time someone at your dinner table or your workplace tells you this war is about keeping America safe from nuclear threats, ask them what happens when the 60-day authorization window resets and there's still no congressional vote. The Blue Bill broke that sequence down this morning. Walk them through it. That's when the real conversation starts. Because the strength of this country has never depended on any single alliance or any single leader. It depends on whether we, the people, insist that the decisions made in our name actually serve our interests. And right now, that question is more urgent than it has been in a very long time.